My name is Steve Winter. I'm a former primary school teacher. I run a small FileMaker web integration development company. I'm from New Zealand. I live back there again, having spent some time in Europe for a little while, but I'm now back at the other end of the earth. A lot of the work that we do is all around integration, and that's kind of where a lot of my focus has been in recent times. I also do quite a bit of cycling. That was me on the west coast of Africa some years back. The previous trip I'd done had been from Beijing in China to Istanbul in Turkey, which took about 5 months. It's about 8,000 miles. So it's a way to get out and see a bit of the world in quite a different sort of a way. A much shorter name for this would have been PSoS with callback. And that's what we're going to talk about. A wise man told me that people in conferences remember about 50% of what I tell them after 90 minutes. Sorry, you'll forget 50% of what I've told you within an hour and 90% of it within some amount of time that I can't remember, which kind of serves to make his point a little bit. So I've enlisted the help of my puppy. He's a 3-year-old border collie. When he's on the slides, that's the thing that matters most, okay? So if you're just kind of drifting in between times when Kuri, my dog, is there, he's the one that knows this stuff best. So please pay attention to him. But before we really get started, I've got a question for you. What's the most uniquely FileMaker thing about FileMaker when you compare it to other databases? And this is like a question, yeah.
Easy user interface.
Easy UI?
It's really heavy on the client.
Heavy on the client side? Other ideas?
The UI and the data are together.
UI and data are together. Now we're getting closer to what I think the crux of this is. I think it's context. And that's very much about that idea of the UI and the data being really tightly bound together, because everything about FileMaker comes back to the context that you're trying to do something within. Now, in more recent versions, it's got a little bit easier to switch context because we can use the execute data API script step, which helps us do that. We can find other ways that we can switch context. But often the reason that we're doing that is because, well, context is the king, and so we have to be in a different context. Now, as we go along through this session, that's going to keep becoming important. Context becomes very important in everything that we do. So, offloading work. There are a whole range of reasons why we might want to do that. Increasing performance is one of the key ones, and that might be meaningful amounts of time, like it might take several minutes for a complex report to be generated. Or it might be a very small amount of time, but it just feels like forever. In one solution that I developed, we were running on some older iPads, and it was only taking a few seconds, but whilst you were sitting there waiting, watching that little hamster run, those few seconds felt like they were taking a huge amount of time. Allowing the change of context, because as I was saying, context is really what it's all about. And it might be that we're wanting to allow for that change of context without having to have the UI do that as well. And then I also mentioned here the centralization of responsibility. One API that I was working with insisted on whitelisting IP addresses in order to be able to access that API. Now, with a distributed workforce, we couldn't have insert from URL being called from lots of different locations. And so we were using that offloading of work, that centralization, as a way to address that. Just as an aside, if you're considering API integrations, that centralization can also help with credential management, because basically then credentials for the API only have to live in one place, on that server, not necessarily elsewhere. As with anything FileMaker, when it comes to offloading work, there are myriad different ways that we can do it. The two main ones that I mention here are the idea of robot machines. Now, many of you have probably gone through that process of having a robot machine, a computer that sits in a corner, connected to FileMaker server, and every so often it does something, or based on some other trigger, it does something. And for many of us, that was where we started before we had Perform Script on server. FileMaker Pro 13 in 2013 was when we first got that Perform Script on server. And so for many of us, we rejoiced because we thought, hey, we can do away with our robot machines and the problems that come with making sure they reconnect when the connection drops and so on. And Perform Script on server really helped us with that. I've also put calling an API as being offloading of work as well, because we are doing that. We're getting some work to be done somewhere else. But that kind of doesn't feel so much to me like it's a FileMaker-y kind of thing. So I kind of mention it there as an aside. Looking back at Perform Script on server, which as I said came in FileMaker 13, there are some things about the way in which it works that become important because of that whole thing I've been saying about context. When Perform Script on server, when the script starts, a whole new session is created. And whilst new and shiny might sound like a great thing, we've got that issue that we don't know where the user was at the point at which they initiated that script. So we have to make sure that script triggers that might run on launch are going to do the things that we need them to do, but not do other things as well. Many of you will have an on first window open script, and you need to be conscious that that script will run every time a Perform Script on server request is made. So you may wish to consider adding a trap in the top of that that says, if I'm running on server, then don't do all of these things that are related perhaps to user interface, because they're not relevant to what is trying to happen on the server. One of the other things to consider is if your scripts that you're running on server rely on global variables, they will have to be initialized as part of that startup process. And they may not be the same as they were for the user who initiated that script. About 18 months ago with FileMaker 2023, or 20.1, depending on how you count, we got PSoS with callback. And I like to think of that as a 3-act show. You have the initiating script, the script that is going to be used to create that initial call. It might be a script, or it may be just a button that's in the user interface. So that's the initiating script. You've then got the server script, the script that is going to be run on the server. And then finally, you get the callback script. Now, up until the callback became available, you had options with Perform Script on server. You could either wait or not. Now with callback, you can, obviously, you're not waiting because it's just going off, and it will make that callback to your callback script when the server script has concluded. If we look at the configuration with Perform Script on server, you get 5 parameters at this point. First up, we get which script will be run on the server. And as with any script, you can say, I want to select it from a list or perform it by name. You can pass a parameter to that script. Now you'll notice that I've put little curly braces there for the parameter, and I maintain that you should always be using JSON when you're passing things as parameters. Even if you only think you need to pass one piece of information at the beginning, chances are you'll think of another one later, and then another one later, and so on. So if you start off always passing JSON, both as your script parameter and your script results, then you're prepared for things to change and to grow. The third parameter for PSoS with callback is the callback script, the script that will be run at the point at which the server-side script concludes. Again, we can specify that from list or by name. It too receives a parameter. Again, I would advocate that you should be passing JSON to everywhere that you're making a script call. And then the fifth parameter is a slightly unusual one. It's called state, and the default for it is continue. Now, the options for this are continue, halt, exit, resume, and pause. And the values might give you a little bit of a hint as to what they do. What they do is they determine what will happen to any running script when the callback is received. Now, typically in FileMaker, what happens is that scripts are added to a queue, and there is a stack of scripts and subscripts which will run in order. Now, the interesting thing here is that we can actually force that script that may be running when the callback comes to halt, or to pause, or resume, and so on. In almost every case that I can think of, you're going to want to stick with the default of continue, because at the point the callback comes, you have absolutely no idea what the user is doing. And if you interrupt the script that they may be running at the time, you've got no way to get back into that, and you may well make for a very poor user experience. So I would suggest that continue is almost always the way you're going to want this to run. The documentation gives a bunch of notes that are worth mentioning. They are important. To save you having to read all of that, I'll summarize. You won't get a callback if there is a crash, the client crashes or the server crashes, if the client has quit FileMaker or the connection is broken. Now, in the case of the last two, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. If they reconnect within 10 minutes, then that callback will still be triggered. I've said here that the race is on. Basically, callbacks happen in the order that the script completes. So if you have multiple calls being sent to perform script on server with callback, you might call them in the order 1, 2, 3. However, they may conclude in the order of 2, 3, 1. So you can never know what order the callbacks will come in, because it will be completely dependent on how long the script takes on the server side. And the final one is that it's fine to have no callback script in the perform script on server with callback script step. And the documentation says that it will behave similar to perform script on server. I don't know what similar to means, but any time that I've tried testing it where I've left out the callback script, it just acts as if we had performed script with server off. Just nothing seems to happen. So I don't quite know why they say similar to. But there we are. The first two acts of our play we're pretty familiar with. Write a script to handle some sort of front-end action, call the script server-side, do some work based on the parameters passed, and it's when we get to Act 3 that we into our uncharted territory. As you saw 2 slides back, the callback can be passed parameters by the calling script, and that makes sense. It's just another script. It can also use the get script result to get the response that comes back from the server-side script. If your server-side script ends with exit script and passes back a nice JSON payload to you, then get script result provides that data to the callback script. There's also a third set of information that's available to that callback script, and that's the context that the user is in at the time that that callback script is initiated. But that one we have to be very careful of because we have no idea what that context might be. I'm going to use a scenario for the rest of this conversation, and it's very close to a real-life example where I have a client who runs a large printing organization. It's a very high-volume, low-margin business, and so they are running thousands of print jobs a day. All of it is done through FileMaker, and they're generating tens of thousands of records a month. they have a client relationship team who work with some of their bigger clients, and they're constantly wanting to see reports to see how the revenue for that client is going as each month progresses. Now, we started off doing this, we were running it just in the browser, just in FileMaker Pro, and it took forever for the report to generate. So we thought what we'd do is we'd run it on the script, and we would put it all into an Excel spreadsheet, and we would give them back that information. We started doing it with wait on, and it took too long. They were sitting there watching the beach ball and waiting and waiting and waiting. So we turned wait off for perform script on server, and we were putting the report into a container field. But oftentimes they were going to client 1, running the report, going to client 2, running the report, going to client 3, running the report, and never really knowing when any of them had been done. So then we thought what we'd do is we'd email them the report. But then they could never find the right report, and they couldn't remember which client it belonged to, and so then we put them in the containers and sent them an email to say that it was in the container for the client, and it got complicated. And so what we wanted to be able to do was to say, hey, for client number 1, your report's ready. And that's where using PSoS with callback becomes very useful. In our initiating script, we're looking at a client in our FileMaker UI, and we set a couple of parameters here. We get the from and the to from a JSON object that's passed in here. We pop up a little card window into which they say, I want to run this report from the 1st to the 5th of the month, or whatever. And our initiating script gets that in. We then create a little payload, which is our nice JSON payload containing the client ID, so the unique ID, the UUID for the client that we're currently on, and we pass in the from and the to our JSON. And we send that off to our server. So we then do perform script on server with callback, and we pass in there the payload. We say we want to run the script client report complete, and we pass in that payload as well. You can see here that we're just passing the same payload to both the script on the server and to the callback script. That has the details we need, the client ID, the date range, and so on. Now, on the server script, we can get our parameters, we can pull the client ID out from there, we can pull the date range we want out from there, we can do the work to create the report, and we're done. In our callback script, if we do the same thing and we do set variable parameters to get the script parameter, who knows what we're going to get in our local variable params if we did this?
You get the original parameter?
The original parameters. You'd think that, wouldn't you? The bad news is that's what you get. You get absolutely nothing. Now, why do you get absolutely nothing? No JSON, no text, just nothing. And here it is. Here he comes. This is the single most important thing that you need to get your head around with PSoS with callback. Field and variable references used in the callback script parameter are evaluated at runtime. So at the point at which we do that get script parameter, we were passing as the parameter the variable payload, and that variable is not defined. And therefore, when we do get script parameter in our callback script, we get nothing. Okay, so in the initiating script, we were passing in our payload, and so if we, hang on, where have we gone? So, next idea, let's not pass in the variable payload, let's create our own little JSON payload and make that as our script parameter for our callback. What are we going to get this time? Yeah, good answer. Nothing. He shrugged. Well, it really depends. We really don't know what we're going to get. We're going to get something that looks a little bit like JSON in that it's going to have some keys of client ID. Will there be a primary key of a client there? Maybe. If the user is still on a layout that's relevant to the client table, then they will get an ID. Will it be the client they were looking at when they started the report? Maybe, maybe not. Will we get date from? Well, no, because that relied on a local variable of from and a local variable of to. And one thing's for sure, it'll be garbage as far as JSON get element is concerned, because it's just not valid JSON. We've got a colon followed by a comma. So, how do we deal with this? Global variables? Maybe. Yep, because global variables, but let's say if we run one report for one client and then we trigger the one for the next one, it's going to overwrite the global variables with a different date range or a different client ID and so on. So the way that I have adopted for dealing with this is that my server-side script will always exit with a JSON payload, and there will always be a parameter, a JSON object in the response, which is the parameters which were originally passed in. And so this achieves what we thought we were going to do in the first place by passing the same payload to the server script and the callback script, because now our callback script can access those parameters, the same parameters that were passed into the server-side script that allowed the server-side script to do everything that it needed to do. So now in our callback script, we can set a variable of response, which we use get script result to get the result back. And then we can set the variable parameters using JSON get element. From the response, we pull out the parameters. And so now our parameters give us exactly what it is that we need. Because remember, we have to be able to get back into context. We have to be able to tell the user what it is that we want to do. So we need to know, which client it was that they were running that report for, and so on. Personally, I think the way this works is kind of a bit unexpected and a little bit quirky. There was apparently some discussion in the ETS about how it should work, and this way was felt to be appropriate. So it is how it is. We simply have to learn to cope with it. And as I said, it is the most difficult bit of dealing with PSoS with callback, because it's just so unexpected, and what you get back is so not actually, in my opinion, very helpful.
Steve, yeah, could you explain why they did it like that? Do you know? A real fundamental, because it is very quirky.
Yeah, so the question is, do I know why they did it like that, and can I explain that? Unfortunately, I can't. I asked Clay at a conference in Australia late last year about why it was like that, and he was a little bit like the gentleman here. He was like, I don't really remember, but I'm sure there was a good reason. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't know. But now you all know that that's how it is, and that we've got great ways, easy ways to work around it. Sean?
So knowing that's how it works.
Yep.
Is there any good use case for using the parameter that you're saying?
Yeah, so Sean's question is, knowing how that it's like that, is there any use of that parameter? There could be if you only needed to pass in textual values. So for example, if you wanted to say that you are running in a particular context, for example. So you might want to say that this report has been generated by the finance department or by the sales team or so on. So you might want to just pass in just a simple piece of text. But I'm grasping at straws here because I don't see that parameter has a lot of value, no. Okay, so we're in our callback script. We know what client ID is. We know the date range that we want. Now what are we going to do? We've kind of got a bunch of options about what we could do. We could go back to the client. We could navigate the user to the client layout, use the client ID to perform a find, to find the client, to show them the report. We could pop up a custom dialog that says, hey, your report for XYZ Limited is ready. But they feel kind of intrusive to me because we've got no idea of what the user is doing. I mean, they could well have gone home for the end of the day and they just don't care, but they could be in the middle of doing something else. They could be on the phone with the client, looking at a different client's record. We've just got no idea about what it is that they're doing. And so those first two options of navigating them from where they are or showing a custom dialog feel very intrusive. Thanks to FileMaker 2024 or version 21, however you want to count, we've got another really cool way of dealing with this because we've got local notifications. And this is what I do pretty much every time I've had a PSoS script that I've got a callback on run, is that I will show a local notification. Prior to FileMaker 2024, they were only available on Go. Since 2024, they're available on both Mac and Windows. And they behave just like any of the other notifications that you get in your operating system. They have a lot of parameters. Now, I can't help but feel like some optimization could have been done because quite a number of these ones aren't overly relevant when we're running them on the client side. What do they look like? Well, they look like any other notification, as I said. So you'll get the little notification, it'll slide out from the right-hand side if you're on a Mac or up from the bottom if you're on Windows, or however you've got it configured. And then you also get a little drop down with some options in there. And I've just popped in a few options, and this is exactly the dialog that's used in the report example I'm using here. We give them the option, show report, remind me in 10, or just close. So if we go back to all of those options, this is kind of how they line up. Name is used internally. We'll come back to that in a minute. The script is a script that will be run when someone interacts with the notification. So this is nothing to do with our callback. This is a separate script that will be run. The delay is how long we wait until the notification is displayed. In the case of my PSoS with callback, I set that to 0 because I say in 0 seconds after I configure the notification, I want to say your report's ready. Then we get the title and the body, which are pretty self-explanatory. We get 3 labels for the buttons, 1, 2, and 3, which show up there. The next ones are about whether or not interacting with the button will bring FileMaker to the foreground or not. Up to you, whether you want it to or not. In my example, if they click Show Report, obviously I do want to bring FileMaker to the front because I'm now going to navigate them to the report. For the other two, I wouldn't bother. If FileMaker were in the background, I'd just leave it in the background because they might be looking at something in Excel and so on. And then the last one, Show When App in Foreground, that's only relevant on Go. So for when we're using this with a desktop client, then that's not relevant. It will always show whether FileMaker is in the foreground or not. Yeah?
Is there a reliable way to check in advance if someone has notifications enabled since they're a system level and people can turn those things off?
In advance, no. Unfortunately, there is not. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. We'll get to the script in a moment, and that does give you some hints towards that. And so you could store in a user preferences table whether the person has notifications turned on or off and use that. And so, yes, you could then store that to say that Mary and Joe have notifications, but Bob doesn't. So bad luck, Bob, you're going to get a custom dialog that says the report's finished.
Maybe like attempting to fire a notification when you log in or something, and then storing the result of whether it aired out maybe.
Yeah. you could do something of that ilk here. So there's unfortunately one more bit of quirky behavior that we have to deal with in the way in which local notifications work, unlike the callback parameters. We get the ability to set a name for our notification, which isn't particularly useful. And we also get to set a script that will be run when someone interacts with it. Now, if we do get script parameter in that script, then we get something else that's really kind of weird. Because we get a list, and then at the end, we get the parameter that we pass to the script. So the list, in order, the name of the notification, so callback complete is what we set as the name, and the next value is the name of the label of the button that they clicked on, which in this case was remind me in 10. The next one is 1, which is whether FileMaker was in the foreground or not. And so that might be useful to us if it wasn't. And then we get our script parameter that we passed into that script. And so it's convoluted because in order to get to the bit of information that we need, we have to destruct a list to then get our JSON off the end. And I would really have liked this script step to have been completely refactored to just use JSON both in and out, because it feels to me like that would have been a much more intuitive way of doing it. But I guess it's back to FileMaker doesn't like to break things that have existed forever, and this list made sense in the Go world, maybe. So in order to support 2 of my options, I'm going to need to be able to re-establish context, because I've got to get the user back where they were. If I want to show them the report, I'm going to have to navigate them to the client and let them access the report that's there. If I want to remind them in 10, then I need to create a new notification which has a delay of 3,600 seconds. And then at the end of that time, they may say, show me the report. So I'm going to have to be able to get them back to the right context. And so, as I keep saying, it's all about getting back into context and passing the data that you need in order to get people into the correct context. So when might you use this? What might you use it for? We've talked about long-running processes, about report generation, about complex data manipulation. You might use it for record generation if you're trying to generate a significant number of records, perhaps from some sort of an upload. When we don't want to wait, but we do want to know when it's done, which is the obvious answer to that, and also for centralized API calls, as I said. And then one other thing to consider would be how can we avoid having to have a callback script for every PSoS request? Particularly where you're going to show a local notification and then redirect the user back to a record or a layout. You could potentially just have one centralized script which manages that process for you. Because if you're passing in the parameters that are needed at the beginning for the server-side script, you're passing those back in your callback, then basically you can use those to have just a single script, because it can know which script ran. It can know that they were generating a payment report, or that they were generating an orders report, or importing users, or whatever the action was. And so then you can show your notification, put the text in there, and have that know which layout you need to go back to, which field to use with the UUID to find the user, and so on. And so often I find that I've just got this centralized show notification callback, and that's my callback for most of my PSoS with callback scripts, because it simply gets called with all of the parameters that it needs to show the right notification, and then take them to the right place at the end of that. And in surprisingly record time, I must have spoken way too quickly. I'm at the questions time. So do people have further questions?
So you're saying you have one master script, I would imagine, that handles all of your callback scripts,
Yes, I have one centralized script that handles pretty much all of the times that I'm using PSoS.
That's expecting some parameter in a certain specific format so that you can basically manage that.
Yes, and so basically, as well as in the example with my payload, I was showing that we were passing in a client ID. Then in fact, I just use UUID, and I also pass in the layout that the PSoS script was triggered from, and I pass in another field, another JSON variable, which has the name of the UUID field. And so then I can go to layout, enter find mode, set field by name to set the client PKID to the UUID from my parameter, perform my find to get me back in. And so I can use that script to navigate to a client. I can use that script to navigate to a job, an order, an invoice, to anywhere in the system that I need to, because that script is completely self-contained and it gets past everything it needs to do, the things that it needs to do.
Yeah. If you, let's say your users are doing some sort of data entry, they get that alert, and they say, show me the report. I'm assuming you leave where they are alone and you open a different layout. Or do you commit what they're doing and move on?
Yeah, so the question is, let's say the user is in the middle of doing some data entry, the notification comes up and they say, show me the report. How do I deal with the context that they're currently in? It depends, of course, but in general, I assume that if the user said, show me the report, they meant it. However, that doesn't always work. And so that's, yeah, you have to prepare for that. You have to trap for that, because you can get into the situation where they go show me the report and it tries to go to a different layout, which results in the record trying to commit and data validation errors and so on. So you do have to prepare for that as much as you can, but ultimately there's very little you can do if the users make poor decisions.
Right, and in your example, you have a spreadsheet that you've put in a container field.
Yeah.
And it's now, the container field has data.
Yeah.
So you could, in theory, just open a layout with.
Yeah, you could say, I am always going to open a new window and navigate in that new window. And that's a good way of dealing with that, because it leaves that window there. Maybe they forget that window's there, but that's probably a better approach than causing them other undue grief.
If I want to replace a robot, do I need the callback? It sounds like I wouldn't really care, right?
If you're trying to replace a robot, do you need the callback? Yeah. Or probably not, because probably a robot machine was just running something, but it may well have been that robot machine was running something and then sending an email. And so rather than sending the email, you could use a callback in place of that robot to show a local notification or something of that sort. It very much depends on what your robot was or is doing. And there are still times when a robot is a better choice than perform script on server, but it depends on your use case. But it's unlikely that you would replace a robot machine with perform script on server with callback, but it depends what the script's doing, and so you might, yeah.
So you have a user who is manipulating a record and leaves in the middle, and so your script is trying to do something, but the record is locked. Do you have any suggestions on?
Okay, so this is, the question is if a user's in the middle of doing something and then leaves blocking a record, do I have any suggestions for how to deal with that? Is shooting them too harsh? Unfortunately, that's yeah. That's just very much a general FileMaker. How do you deal with locked records sort of situations? Yeah, not really. I don't know, has anyone else got suggestions for how you deal with locked records?
You kick them out from the admin panel?
You could kick them out from the admin panel. That is an option. It's not one you can automate. Well, I suppose you could with the admin API, but yeah. Any other questions or observations?
What happens if a user doesn't have notifications allowed on their workstation?
Right. What happens if a user doesn't have notifications allowed on their workstation? Nothing.
You don't get an error or anything?
No.
Okay.
No. And just nothing. And that's why coming back to someone else was saying, can you know in advance? Unfortunately, not. I can't think of a way around that either.
If you use MBS, you could do that.
The suggestion is if you use the MBS plugin, you could get around that. So yeah, you could if that's the route you were considering. Yeah.
I'm not that familiar with server-side scripts. I haven't really been able to find a use for them yet in
Okay.
the development that I have. But one of the questions that I do have is, once you start a script and it's executing, and then it finally returns back, how is that data displayed? Is it a separate subset from the data that's in FileMaker, or is it you switch to a layout and it's automatic?
So the question is, when a script is performed on the server and it returns, how do you display that data? There is no data that comes back from that script other than if you use an exit script and pass a parameter there. So if, for example, your server-side script found a bunch of records, at the user side, you have no visibility of that found set. And so you don't necessarily know what the server did or does. And the only way to do that would be to pass back in the exit script result a list of the IDs or the query that was performed on the server. When you're processing stuff on the server side, it's somewhat assumed that you will be telling the server which found set to use or which record to operate on, and that you already had that in context in the client before you started. Does that answer your question?
It does. So you're basically coming back with only a small amount of data that can be utilized after the script has been performed?
So the comment is you're only coming back with a small amount of data. You could in fact return quite a significant amount of data, because you could put quite a large body of JSON into the script result, which if you're using callback, then the callback script could then use. Or if you were just doing perform script on server with wait on, then in that script you could do get script result, and it would give you that payload that came back.
So generally speaking, the payload is a fixed, it's basically a fixed length of data that is pertinent to that particular script that you're running. It's not necessarily a huge set of data that you would do with performing a find, for instance.
So yes, effectively, the parameters that you're passing into the server script are generally relatively minimal, but they don't have to be, but they are generally relatively minimal, and you are generally expecting relatively minimal data to be returned in that transaction, which isn't to say that a significant amount of action couldn't occur in the server-side script, but the input and the output from that script are generally relatively minimal and just used enough to provide the context for the script to do its job and to be able to complete with the result coming back.
So when you say you're returning back from a script and you're wanting to display the data, you're specifically pulling the script variable that when it was done and placing that onto a layout?
Probably not. No, probably what I'm doing is navigating the user to a place where they can see the result of that. So I'm taking them to a newly created record, I'm taking them to a layout where they can view the report that's been generated, I'm taking them to a layout that has the chart data that's been compiled on the server, and so on.
But I think what he's trying to say, and see if I can interpret you. So let's say that his scripts tells FileMaker, hey, I need to find 1,000 records, right? You could potentially have the exit script out of the server put a big old JSON of 1,000 IDs back to his callback script, and then the callback script would have all those 1,000 records that it found, right? Because you don't want to wait, right? And then you could potentially have a callback script that could say, okay, here are the 1,000.
Absolutely.
Or maybe a snapshot link, I don't know.
Yeah. If you find yourself wanting to pass large amounts of data to and from server-side scripts, you may need to rethink how you're doing it, because I wouldn't typically expect that to be the case. It might be, but not typically.
And that little X on the local notification, it operates as if it never showed up, or the like dismiss it with the Mac OS has
That one up there. You will get in here in the you'll get the callback complete. Instead of remind me in 10, you'll just get an empty string in there. Yeah. So, yeah, you kind of know it happened, but yeah. Any other questions or observations? Or okay, well, thank you very much. Please, if you can rate this session. And I can continue answering questions either now or over the next day and a half.